Okay, so this week we had reconfirmation that Ghost of Tsushima is coming to PC. There's going to be a PC port. Nixxes is handling it, which is great news. But we did get some extra disclosures. We'll talk about a couple of them. The first one being the recommended specifications. And I'm curious what you make of this one, Alex.
They're more or less the same as all the other Nixxes ones.
Right.
I mean, I hope you noticed that too. Like, I've seen these specs before. And based upon the wording, it seems like those high settings will be PS5 settings again. This seems to be their motto, their MO. And the very high settings will be, something slightly higher than whatever the PlayStation 5 version of the game is doing.
It's that kind of precise technical insight that sets Digital Foundry apart from the competition.
Well, I think the whole idea is that we have an idea of what the specs are of the PlayStation 5, and we see the amount of time, effort, etc., all these things that they can put in to a version that Nixxes is making, and it's the same developer porting these game engines to PC, and they're taking a lot of the work here, and they're making it very, it's the portable version on PC that they make. It's not the same version of the game that was just shipped on console. So we're seeing similar levels of, like, I would describe it as optimization for the PC port. So the fact that it looks similar to even some wildly different game engine like Horizon Forbidden West or Ratchet and Clank, well, that just shows the work that Nixxes does. And I think here, at least there, I guess for that high setting, it is a little curious that basically for all of the Nixxes ports, like something like an RTX 3070 is more in line with the PS5's like output in terms of raw shading power at times than, for example, in other multi-platform games we see. So I think that just kind of follows the trend there. The one thing that I'm a little bit curious about here, though, is the textures. Once again, I'm always curious about like what the textures are in these games. They do put the RTX 3070 there right next to a GPU that has much more VRAM than it, right, from the AMD side. Nixxes ports are interesting where they, and I'm going to talk about this later when we get to Avatar GDC presentations, that where they explicitly use the heterogeneous memory configuration on PC for graphical tasks. There are like low priority things in system memory that are being used if you have an 8GB GPU, for example, and you're at like a moderately high resolution with a moderately high texture setting. It'll be using those all the time, doing stuff over the PCIe bus in a way that is supposed to protect performance. But it doesn't always do that, depending upon user settings. And like, for example, people turn the textures to very high, or in something like Ratchet and Clank, they turn the ray tracing up, and that is a competition for resources in video memory. The one thing I'm curious here is whether or not this port will suffer the same kind of like VRAM consequences as a result of that system. Like where I kind of found that, for example, in Horizon Forbidden West, that if you were using the high resolution textures at a resolution that was above 1440p, your GPU could totally be capable of rendering that, like actually really well in the case of the 3070. But as soon as anything more important, like some event occurred where there was greater strain on the PCIe bus, it would just, performance would completely fall apart. And I think that leads to actually a bad user experience because it's not so transparent to the user what exactly the issue is. So I'm just curious to see what that is like here. I mean, this is originally a PS4 game.
I was about to say.
Yeah. So I'm hoping, unlike those PS5 targeted games, that is a little bit lower on the VRAM requirement to make those users just have a better time in general. But I guess we'll see. There's other stuff to talk about, though. Of course.
Yeah, I mean, it does look like a cut and paste of the Horizon Forbidden West.
That's why I said that, yeah.
and I'm a bit mystified by this because it is a PS4 game at its heart, and the enhancements to the PlayStation 5 version weren't exactly, game changing, I don't think. So I am curious to see whether it will actually run on, much more sort of attainable configurations. RTX 2060 should be wiping the floor with a PS4 level game, particularly with DLSS.
It really should.
And, I'm not sure they actually crafted higher resolution assets. I'd have to go back and look at the coverage. Thoughts on this one, Oliver?
Yeah, I think the specs are interesting insofar as there is a little bit of hope perhaps for lower end devices, because there are a couple differences from Horizon Forbidden West. One of those is listing only 8 gigabytes of RAM as a requirement, system RAM as a requirement. And they also support HDDs explicitly in the lowest end mode, or in that minimum specification, which wasn't true for Horizon. So I think those plus the fact that the game is really a 4-year-old PS4 title at heart, like the PS5 enhancements, mostly boiled down to resolution and frame rate. I think those factors would suggest a game that could scale potentially to lower-end devices. But at the same time, on the GPU end of things, they're quoting a 960 or a 5500 XT, which is a little bit curious because the 960, I think, is a lot slower than a 5500 XT. So that's
we had that. We had that question from Philippe. Hey there, DF exclamation point. What do you think about the apparent discrepancy in Ghost of Tsushima's hardware requirements on the lowest settings? They've mentioned GTX 964 gigabyte and 5500 XT to be both capable of running the game at 720p 30, while being two completely different class of hardware. The relative performance differentials around 70% in favor of 5500 XT. Are you going to test this claim? What do you think about the requirements in general? Thanks for your work and have a great day! Exclamation point. I think the main issue whenever you put together a recommended specs requirement page is that you kind of have got to address hardware that people have or more likely to have. And you want to have both the AMD and NVIDIA alternatives. 5500 XT, if you look at there, it's basically all of the AMD GPUs are GPUs that are kind of like fairly recent. Whereas with the NVIDIA side, they've gone for a wider range of hardware, but arguably more popular hardware. I mean, a ton of 960s were sold. Barely any 4 gigabyte variants, mind you. 960 was primarily a 2 gigabyte card, so I'm a bit curious about that. The alternative to the 960 would have been Chex Notes, the R9 280, which
I had to look at that,
which barely anybody ever bought, which was a real shame because it was actually faster than the 960 back in the day. I think it is just basically trying to find a point of reference for people to understand.
I mean, there's that. There's also driver support.
Yeah, you're quite right.
On a purely technical level, those GPUs still get support from NVIDIA. I believe the RX 580 Vega, Polaris GPUs and such, and more. Even older, just old GCN definitely doesn't get driver updates anymore to the same. Well, the older GCN doesn't at all, but I think RX 580 maybe gets security updates, but it doesn't actually get like the features and the performance optimizations anymore. So I think it maybe like runs with modern Windows and doesn't have an issue there, but it could be that. It could be that too. Or there could be some weird thing. I have no idea what it could be. It could be some DX12 specific thing that the game requires an RX 5000 series GPU that also has driver support at that point. Like we saw it in the past. I know. I'm just
you're spitballing.
I'm spitballing here, but I think in the past we saw with Death Stranding there was like a usage of a DX12 feature that was not supported.
Locks out all the older supposedly DX12 compatible GPUs.
Yeah, they were not DX12 compatible at that point.
The driver situation does sound like the most plausible explanation, right? Because driver support for Vega is now over, and that immediately precedes RDNA 1, right? Which is what an RX 5500 XT is. So I think that is the most plausible explanation for that. Moving on, we actually had another story that came out of this particular PlayStation blog, which is that trophies are coming to the PC versions of the game, and there's also going to be what is described as a PlayStation overlay. But in theory, this is actually a pretty good idea, right, Oliver?
Yeah, I think it's very interesting. Very interesting. I think it suggests that Sony is treating PC more like a first-class platform by essentially bringing the same features that Microsoft has on the PC over to the PlayStation platform, putative PlayStation platform. The overlay looks interesting as well. If I was to speculate, maybe Sony might consider doing more day-and-date PC releases in the future, because they are building some functionality into the platform that would be very helpful for a lot of cross-platform communication and friends list and things like this. That would actually be very interesting, a future in which Sony is bringing games more towards a simultaneous or near simultaneous release on PC, because I do think that the console and PC audiences are separate, and I think that what Sony has in front of it is a problem where, even though the PS5 was sold almost as well as the PS4, I think when you're looking back at the PS4, that the sales trajectory of the two consoles is almost exactly identical. I think they hit like 50 million sales within a week of each other relative to their timeline in the console lifecycle. But obviously there are some recent games that have not sold super well. I've seen some claims that perhaps Final Fantasy VII Rebirth sold as little as around 2 to 3 million copies based off the tracking data. And you have to wonder if maybe that title was shipping on PC as well. Maybe they shift an extra 500,000 or even 1 million units, or some high number of units, presumably in the hundreds of thousands. And maybe that does move the needle a little bit for some of these titles that might otherwise have a little bit of trouble achieving market penetration on a console that's, only partway through its life cycle, only sold 55 million units or however many they've sold. It's not a tremendous base of users to ship a game on, right? It's just not huge.
Right.
Yeah. Any thoughts on this overlay, Alex? I mean, the thing that confuses me is you're getting parity on trophies, but can you actually move your save games across between PS5 and PC? There's no mention of that. There's mention of crossplay, which I'd assume would be for something like Helldivers.
Yeah, that's an interesting part. And I imagine if they did do that, and I really think they should, that it might be one of those rare instances where you require actually, oh my gosh, excuse me, I always forget the name of not Xbox Live.
PlayStation Network? PlayStation Network, PS Plus.
The PS Plus. You may need a PS Plus account in that case to actually unlock it, which, I mean, that's fair enough at that point. That's their ecosystem. That's the last little bastion thing that I want to see, because I think it's been really great in the games I've seen it in. We use it all the time on the channel in those games that have it. Like we've used it in Cyberpunk.
Ubisoft
we
games
definitely used it in Baldur's Gate. All those Xbox, Microsoft games tend to support it in a really good way. So I would like to see that. And I think this is just mainly bringing a little bit of that ecosystem and honestly prestige status of Sony stuff to PC. Can you really be saying you're supporting the platform if you're not giving them similar outlets to show how PlayStation loyal they are, show how PS focused it is? It's not just a PC game; it's a PS game. Sorry, I'm slashing it's a PS game on PC. So this is another way to brand it in a more hardcore way. One thing that I hope that they don't do is that this is some sort of Trojan horse way to unleash their own launcher or something like that. Please don't have a separate launcher. You can maybe have a store. I don't care, but don't have a separate launcher.
A store needs a launcher, surely, Alex.
Just buy it from their website and it hands you a Steam key, or I don't know, something silly. I just don't want to launch it. I've got 7.
The point of making a store would be to bypass the Steam fees, so you can't use the store to get a Steam key, I don't think.
I have no idea then, Rich. I'm out of my element here. I just don't want another launcher on PC at this point.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, it would be too much, but I do think there needs to be tighter integration between PC and PlayStation. Let's say, for example, you want to play Tsushima on Steam Deck and your PC and your PlayStation 5. I suppose Sony would be saying, we'll buy a PlayStation Portal, but it's not the same by any stretch of the imagination. And I think that sort of level of integration between PC and PlayStation needs to be there, really. Not just the trophies and the friends lists and whatnot. You need to be able to start a game and finish a game on whichever of the platforms you've paid for. Just kind of makes sense to me. But yeah, I mean, obviously this is going to be really interesting, because I don't think we've seen Nixxes tackle a Sucker Punch game before. So I'm expecting it's going to be a decent port. Very curious about these specifications for what is basically a PlayStation 4 game, really. So maybe it's actually somewhat on the conservative side, which is maybe for the best because, you know, you've got to sort of under-promise, over-deliver, right?